I don't want excuses. I want to know who locked the master bedroom while my wife ended up sleeping in the housekeeper's quarters. The sharp crack of a new key hitting the marble kitchen island made the whole room go still. Hayden was still wearing the wrinkled shirt from his flight, his coat hanging open, and there was no trace of sleep in his eyes. Avery stood near the doorway, wrapped in a gray cardigan over her pajamas, her hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, her expression unsettlingly calm. Cassandra crossed her arms. Randall dropped his gaze to his coffee mug. Diane never looked away from her son. Hayden pointed to the key he had just wrenched from the bedroom lock he shared with his wife, and asked again who had changed it. Nobody answered. He turned to Avery, waiting for an explanation. She stayed quiet. 20 minutes earlier, Hayden had walked into the house convinced his early return would be a surprise. He had set his suitcase down in the entryway and crept upstairs, imagining Avery still asleep. But his key had not fit the bedroom door. After trying twice, he moved down the hall, calling her name softly, until a faint light at the far end of the service corridor caught his attention. There, he found a narrow room designed for a household employee to rest during late-night shifts. Avery was asleep in a twin bed, 2 closed suitcases against the wall, and several work boxes stacked near the closet. It did not look like someone who had ended up there by accident. It looked like someone who had begun quietly withdrawing from a life. If this story has already pulled you in, stay with us until the end, because sometimes a locked door reveals more than an entire family ever could. Cassandra was the first to break the silence. She said that Avery had chosen that room to blow everything out of proportion and turn a simple household matter into a public scene. Hayden turned toward his sister with an expression so cold she stopped smiling. Randall jumped in immediately, asking everyone not to draw conclusions before they had all been heard. Diane remained still. Hayden asked about the lock again, this time without raising his voice. Avery could have pointed directly at Cassandra. She could have listed every gesture, every comment, every small humiliation that had piled up during her husband's absence. She didn't. She simply said she didn't want a defense cobbled together in the heat of a 4 a.m. confrontation. The real problem was no longer who held a key, it was that someone had believed they had the right to decide where she belonged inside her own home. Hayden stepped toward her and asked about the suitcases. Avery said she was leaving that same day. He went still, as though the words had physically hit him. He wanted to know where she planned to go and why she hadn't called him. She answered that she had options and that she was not about to wait for someone to hand back her bedroom as though it were a privilege being restored to her. She also said she didn't want him forcing anyone into a rushed apology just to settle the room down. Hayden pressed harder about the call. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" His voice finally cracked with a fear he could no longer keep underneath. Avery looked at him for a long moment before answering. She told him that she had needed to know what he would do when he saw reality with his own eyes, without her having to first ask him to believe her. Diane looked down for the first time. Avery's answer left another question hanging in the air between them. What had she known before Hayden came home? He looked at his mother, then at his wife, sensing a tension between the two of them that was different from whatever existed with Cassandra. Avery offered nothing more. She just pulled her cardigan tighter and said that if they wanted to understand how 2 suitcases had ended up next to a housekeeper's bed, they would need to remember how everything had started 8 days earlier. Hayden felt a chill move through him. Until that morning, he had considered himself a reasonable husband who loved his wife and kept the peace in a complicated family. He had never once asked himself whether his habit of staying neutral could become its own kind of abandonment. 8 days before, when he had zipped up his bag for a work trip to Chicago, he was still certain that the biggest problem in his house was that Avery and Cassandra simply had incompatible personalities. The night before he left, the 5 of them had dinner together in the main dining room of the family estate in Connecticut. Hayden scrolled through messages from his Chicago team while Randall talked about the family business. Cassandra mentioned a private gathering she wanted to host during the week, and glancing at Avery's work folders on a nearby console table, commented that she hoped the living room wouldn't end up looking like a showroom for flooring samples and paint swatches. Avery looked up calmly and pointed out that those folders were there because Randall had asked for her input on a renovation project. Cassandra smiled with practiced innocence. I'm just saying, when someone marries into a family with established traditions, it helps to understand where your lane is. Diane set down her fork. Hayden heard every word. He also saw Avery's jaw tighten. But instead of stopping his sister, he asked if they could change the subject because he had an early flight in the morning. Avery didn't argue at the table. She waited until they were alone in their bedroom. While she removed her earrings in front of the mirror, she asked Hayden if he had understood what Cassandra had just implied. He said yes, but added that his sister had an unpleasant way of saying things, and it wasn't worth turning every comment into a battle. Avery set one earring on the dresser and looked at him through the mirror. She asked how many more times she would have to hear the same explanation before he accepted that the problem wasn't her sensitivity. It was Cassandra's habit of testing exactly how much contempt she could get away with. Hayden sighed, walked over, and told her he didn't want to leave a family war behind him. He promised to talk to his sister when he got back. He said it warmly, genuinely believing he was choosing balance. Avery heard something else. Peace depended on her absorbing the blow until it was convenient for him to step in. Hayden tried to put his arms around her from behind, and she didn't pull away. She knew he loved her. But the small wounds never triggered his instinct. Cassandra's condescending remarks, the social exclusions, the silences from Randall, the casual jabs during family dinners, they always seemed too minor to justify a real confrontation. Avery had ended up being the person everyone called strong, precisely because no one wanted to carry the discomfort of actually defending her. She placed her hands over his and asked if he had ever thought about what it costs to always be the most understanding person in the room. He told her they would talk it through calmly when he got back. Then he kissed her on the top of her head. She closed her eyes and wondered whether love could still be a refuge when the person you loved kept quietly asking one part of you to stay out in the cold. The next morning, Hayden came downstairs early to finish packing his documents for the trip. While he was on the phone in the home office, Diane found Avery in the entryway and asked for 5 minutes alone. She guided her into a small sitting room the family used for private conversations. Once the door closed, Diane asked a question Avery had not expected. If you ever had to leave this house, could you support yourself without relying on Hayden financially? Avery frowned and said yes. She had never stopped working as an architect. She had her own income and had never depended on the Caldwell family fortune. Diane nodded slowly as if the answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she asked whether Avery could bring herself to leave even if she still loved her husband. The discomfort became alarm. "What are you trying to tell me?" Avery asked. Diane took a moment before responding. She said she had been watching a pattern in Hayden for a long time that no one seemed to consider serious because it always came wrapped in good intentions. Her son was capable of firing a director walking away from a contract or absorbing a major financial loss without hesitation. But at home, he confused caution with absence. When it came to family conflict, he never fully chose a side. Avery asked what any of that had to do with the strange question about leaving. Diane said that during the days of the trip, she was not going to smooth things over every time tension flared with Cassandra. She was not going to soften comments, redirect conversations, or quietly repair what others broke. "I want to see what's left when no one fixes things before Hayden comes home." Avery stood up. The idea struck her as cruel, and she said so without dressing it up. Her dignity was not a laboratory experiment for evaluating a grown man. Diane accepted the rebuke without defending herself. She assured Avery that she could stop the whole thing at any moment simply by saying the word. Then she added something that made the conversation even more unsettling. She preferred Avery not call Hayden to report each incident. If he received a running list of grievances from Chicago, he might react out of obligation, issue a couple of instructions from a distance, and come home convinced he had solved a problem he had never truly been willing to examine. Avery asked what she was supposed to do instead. Diane said to observe, not to provoke anything, not to tolerate anything she considered genuinely unacceptable, but to watch what each person did when Hayden wasn't in the room, and above all to pay attention to what he did when he came home and found consequences that nobody had buried beforehand. Avery felt an immediate resistance to the whole idea. But she also recognized that the question Diane was asking had already been living inside her marriage for a long time. Avery moved to the window of that small sitting room. From there, she could see the car idling in the driveway, waiting for Hayden. She asked Diane what would happen if the answer they found turned out to be the worst possible one. Diane didn't answer right away. She only said that in that case, Avery would have the right to make a decision, knowing that no one had pressured her or protected her artificially from the truth. That answer did not reassure Avery. It reminded her that the Caldwells were accustomed to turning even their emotions into endurance tests. She turned to face her mother-in-law and set one condition. Nobody would decide for her how much she should endure. If she felt a real line had been crossed, she would leave, even if Hayden hadn't returned yet. And if he came back and asked her once more to absorb a humiliation in the name of keeping the peace, there would be no second trial. Diane nodded. Avery added that she also would not allow anyone to later call it a victory simply because Hayden did the bare minimum a husband should have been doing all along. When they came out of the room, Hayden was already at the front door with his phone in one hand and his car keys in the other. He asked what they had been talking about. Diane said work. Avery didn't correct her. Hayden kissed his mother, shook Randall's hand, and tossed Cassandra a warning in an almost joking tone. "Don't drive my wife crazy while I'm gone." Cassandra raised both hands in mock innocence. Avery noted quietly that that one sentence summarized everything that worried her. Hayden acknowledged his sister could cross lines, but he kept it light because keeping it light meant he didn't have to do anything about it before it happened. When he turned to Avery, he hugged her tightly and promised he would try to get back a day early. She wished him safe travels. She wanted to tell him that maybe, when he returned, the house wouldn't look quite the same as the one he was leaving behind. She didn't say it. The car rolled slowly down the gravel driveway and disappeared behind the gate. Avery stood in the entryway for a moment, watching the empty space where it had been. Margaret, the household manager, who had been with the family for years, stepped out to collect a folder left on a side table and noticed Avery's expression. She asked if she was all right. Avery said yes. Margaret didn't look convinced. She had worked with this family long enough to tell the difference between a quiet silence and one loaded with decisions. Diane appeared behind them and said nothing. Avery thought about the conversation in the sitting room, about the promise not to intervene, and about that uncomfortable question regarding financial independence. Until that morning, she had never seriously considered leaving the estate. But as she watched the gate close, she decided that during this week, she would be watching her own limits just as carefully as she watched everyone else's. She didn't have to wait long for the first sign. Cassandra came down the front stairs with a thick folder under her arm and called for Margaret to inform her that during Hayden's absence, she would be coordinating all preparations for the family gathering. Margaret gently reminded her that Avery also lived there and that decisions affecting private spaces were typically discussed with both spouses. Cassandra replied that there was no need to complicate simple tasks and that Hayden trusted his family. Then she looked at Avery with a controlled smile and added that perhaps these few days would be a good opportunity to restore the house to its usual priorities. Avery held her gaze. There was no direct insult, only a threat dressed in good manners. She instinctively looked toward Diane, half expecting even a small correction. Diane was only a few feet away. She had heard every word, and exactly as she had announced, she remained silent. Cassandra read that silence as permission. She pressed the folder to her chest, turned toward Margaret, and began listing schedule changes, room assignments, and new instructions for the household staff. Then she turned back to Avery and said with deliberate calm, "While Hayden is away, this house is going to run the way it always did before." Avery felt the sentence settle between them with a meaning far heavier than domestic scheduling. Before meant before her, before the marriage, before someone outside the Caldwell bloodline had any standing to weigh in, decide, or belong. Diane stood there motionless. Avery understood then that the week ahead would not only be a test of Hayden, it would reveal exactly how far a family would go when they believed no one would hold them accountable. And for the first time, she decided that if the door to her marriage closed, she would not be the one left knocking on it from outside. The first morning without Hayden started with something so small that under other circumstances, Avery might have doubted herself. She came down to the dining room at her usual time and found her regular seat occupied by several of Cassandra's event folders. Nobody suggested it was intentional. Randall was reading a financial newsletter on his tablet. Diane was having coffee without looking up. Cassandra pointed to the chair at the opposite end and mentioned she needed her documents within easy reach. Avery could have moved the folders and sat where she had been sitting for months, right beside Hayden's chair. Instead, she took the other seat, not because she was accepting the gesture, but because she wanted to see how far this new hierarchy would go when no one pushed back. Margaret noticed. So did Diane. Only Cassandra seemed to enjoy the fact that a seemingly insignificant rearrangement had happened without resistance. Over breakfast, Cassandra began describing the guest list for the gathering as though she were running a military operation. She would reconfigure the living room, relocate 2 decorative pieces, and use the library for a private meeting before the main event. Avery listened until she heard that Cassandra intended to remove from the living room several display boards of materials she was using for a renovation project Randall had personally commissioned. She calmly pointed out that the work had a deadline approaching and she needed those samples to remain accessible. Cassandra said a family gathering took precedence over some architecture project. Randall looked up, but instead of clarifying that he had requested the work himself, he murmured that they could probably find a practical solution. Avery felt the familiar irritation of watching a documented fact get transformed into a personality dispute. She didn't argue. She asked where they planned to store her materials and insisted on a dry, secure, and accessible room. Cassandra agreed with a smile that was far too satisfied. That same afternoon, Avery discovered that the boxes had been moved to a storage room off the garage without anyone informing her. One of them was sitting directly on the floor near a damp wall. She didn't lose her composure. She called Margaret, inspected every sample, and photographed the condition of everything for her own professional records. Margaret apologized and explained that Cassandra had given the instructions while she was with a vendor. Avery told her she had nothing to apologize for. Then she arranged to have the boxes sent to her architecture studio the following day. It was the first concrete decision to move something from her life out of that house. When she finished, she found Diane standing in the doorway watching her. Avery asked if this was also part of her experiment. Diane replied that she had not ordered anything moved. "But you didn't stop it either," Avery replied. Diane had no answer that sounded dignified. The next day, the transformation of the house continued, with a precision that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. 2 framed wedding photos of Hayden and Avery disappeared from a console table in the living room to make space for floral arrangements. An architecture book Avery had left near the sofa appeared inside a box. Her favorite coat, which always hung near the front door, had been moved to a secondary closet. No single gesture was severe on its own. Together, they carried an unmistakable message. Her presence could be rearranged without asking her. Avery began to understand that the most effective form of contempt does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it is built by moving objects a few inches every day until the person starts to wonder whether she ever truly had a place of her own. Margaret wanted to immediately restore the photographs. Avery stopped her. "I don't want you quietly repairing what others are doing in plain sight," she said. Margaret understood then that Avery was watching something larger than Cassandra's behavior. That evening, Hayden called from Chicago while Avery was reviewing blueprints in their bedroom. His voice sounded tired, but affectionate. He asked how the day had gone, and she said she had been working a lot. He joked that Cassandra had probably turned the house into a full-scale event venue by now. Avery looked toward the console where the wedding photo used to be and felt the temptation to tell him everything. 3 details would have been enough for Hayden to understand something was very wrong. But she remembered the conversation with Diane and, more importantly, she remembered her own decision. She didn't want a solution delivered by phone or an order for everyone to behave until he returned. She wanted to know what he would do when reality wasn't filtered through her account of it. Hayden ended the call by telling her he missed her. Avery said the same. Then she set the phone face down and stared at the darkened screen for several minutes, wondering when love had started requiring proof she had never asked for. On the third day, Cassandra crossed a more visible line. During lunch, 2 outside event coordinators arrived to review the layout of the gathering space. In front of them, they asked Avery whether they could temporarily adjust the arrangement in a zone connecting to Hayden's home office. Before she could respond, Cassandra cut in and said, "No need to consult her on these things. The family makes the decisions about the house." The comment landed with almost perfect casualness. The coordinators looked at Avery with uncomfortable caution. Randall cleared his throat, but did not correct his daughter. Diane's expression stayed closed. Avery set down her fork and asked Cassandra what she meant exactly by family. Cassandra answered that she meant those who had grown up there and understood how things had always worked. Avery held her gaze and replied that then there was no confusion at all. They weren't talking about event logistics. They were talking about belonging. The dining room went quiet. Cassandra tried to soften it with a light laugh and said that Avery was too sensitive since Hayden had been gone. It was at that moment that Avery made a decision that surprised even Diane. She stood up, picked up her phone, and told the coordinators that they were welcome to work with Cassandra if that was the structure the family wished to establish, but that any changes affecting her personal belongings, her work, or the private areas of the marriage would need to be discussed directly with her. She made no threats. She asked no one's permission. That afternoon, she called a real estate agent she had worked with several years earlier and asked to look at small apartments near her studio. She wasn't looking for luxury or a prestigious address. She wanted a place she could afford on her own, where every object stayed exactly where she decided to put it. After she hung up, she felt a strange mix of fear and relief. It was the first time she had turned an abstract possibility into an actual exit. Margaret found her browsing listings on a laptop in the back kitchen and understood immediately. She asked if Avery was really thinking about leaving. Avery halfway closed the screen, not to hide it, but because she didn't want the conversation to become an interrogation. She explained that she hadn't yet made a final decision about her marriage, but she had made one about something else. She would not stay in a house where her dignity depended on who happened to be out of town. Margaret looked at her with quiet sadness and confided that she had spent years watching the Caldwells avoid conflict until the silence ended up always protecting the most aggressive person in the room. Randall never confronted Diane about family tension. Diane quietly cleaned up Cassandra's excesses behind the scenes, and Hayden preferred for everything to settle down before he had to choose a side. "You are not weak for being tired of that," Margaret said. Avery thanked her but asked her not to call Hayden. She needed no one to do for her what she was trying to decide for herself. That afternoon, she visited 2 apartments. The first had great light, but was too far from her office. The second had a small terrace, a narrow kitchen, and a bedroom with a view of a tree-lined street. It looked nothing like the Caldwell estate, and precisely because of that, Avery breathed differently the moment she walked in. There were no family portraits, no inherited furniture, no rooms that had spent decades signaling who belonged and who was a guest. The agent explained the rent and the lease terms. Avery asked for until the following day to decide. When she returned to the estate, she found Cassandra instructing staff to use the master bedroom as a temporary storage space for event dresses, boxes, and accessories. Avery stopped in the middle of the hallway. She asked if Cassandra was referring to the bedroom she shared with Hayden. Cassandra replied that it would only be for a few days, and that since he wasn't there, she didn't see an issue. Avery told her that she was there. Cassandra smiled. And that was the beginning of the real confrontation. Avery made clear that nothing belonging to the event was entering her bedroom. Cassandra replied that the room was part of the estate, and the estate belonged to the Caldwell family. Avery reminded her that a home also becomes such through the daily life, the privacy, and the personal boundaries of the people who live in it. Cassandra mocked her professional tone and asked if she was now going to design rules for a house that had existed long before she ever met Hayden. Randall appeared at the end of the corridor and asked them to lower their voices. Avery looked directly at him and asked whether he thought it was normal for someone to want to use a married couple's bedroom without the consent of either spouse. Randall said he didn't think there was any need to argue over something temporary. That sentence was worse than a refusal. Avery understood that for him, any overreach could be made small enough if acknowledging it required discomfort. Diane witnessed the scene from the staircase. Her eyes moved toward Cassandra, but she did not intervene. The next day, Avery came home from the studio a little after 6 and found 2 boxes of gowns in the hallway in front of her bedroom door. The door was closed. She put in her key and it didn't turn. She tried again, thinking she had made a mistake. Nothing. Margaret appeared from down the corridor and went pale at the sight. Avery asked if someone had called a locksmith. Margaret admitted that a man had been there that morning because Cassandra had said there was a problem with the lock. Avery felt something cold move through her chest. She went downstairs and found Cassandra looking over floral arrangements in the living room. "Did you have the lock on my bedroom changed?" she asked. Cassandra didn't even pretend to be surprised. She said the old one had been acting up, and that controlling access while the event preparations were underway would be more practical. Avery demanded the new key. Cassandra said she would give it to her after the event. Diane walked into the room at that moment and immediately understood how far things had gone. For the first time since Hayden had left, Diane reacted without hesitation. She told Cassandra to hand over the key. Cassandra protested that everything was organized and that Avery could use a guest room for a few nights. Diane repeated the order. But Avery raised her hand. She didn't want the key. Cassandra looked at her with a satisfaction that lasted only a few seconds because Avery's expression was not defeat. It was decision. "I want to know one thing," Avery said, turning to Diane. "Did you know about this?" Diane replied that she had seen the locksmith but assumed it was a repair. Avery asked when she had understood the truth. Diane admitted that she had only just fully grasped it now. Avery nodded slowly. Then she remembered the promise she had made in that small sitting room. If she decided a line had been crossed, she would be the one to determine what happened next. The lock had just made that promise impossible to ignore. Diane offered to stop everything immediately. She could have the locksmith come back that night, restore the room, and cancel any planned use of the bedroom. Avery looked at her and understood the paradox. For days she had wanted to know what happened when Diane stopped quietly correcting the family's excesses before they became visible. Now she had the answer. Cassandra had no limits because she had spent years believing someone would always fix the consequences afterward. But Avery also didn't want her mother-in-law turning back into the person who cleaned up the mess before Hayden could see it. "Don't open that door for me," she said. Diane frowned. Avery explained that if the lock was changed before Hayden returned, everyone could pretend it had been a poor decision that had already been resolved. She didn't want a staged scene, but she also didn't want a varnished truth. Diane asked where she planned to sleep. Avery said she would figure it out. Cassandra, unable to grasp the weight of that calm, believed she had won. Margaret offered to prepare one of the main floor guest rooms. Avery thanked her, but said no. She walked with her down the service corridor and pointed to the small room where staff occasionally rested during late-night events. It had a twin bed, a simple dresser, and a narrow window that looked onto the grounds. Margaret shook her head. "You don't have to sleep here." Avery told her she knew that, which was exactly why she was going to. If the Caldwell family believed they could move her out of her bedroom as though she were a temporary presence, that room would show without any embellishment where they had decided to put her. She didn't want to dramatize the situation, but she wasn't going to soften it either. Margaret helped her carry a few basics over. When Diane appeared in the doorway and saw Avery arranging her toiletry bag beside the small lamp, her face changed. For the first time, she seemed to understand that her test had a cost she could not control. That night, Avery didn't sleep well. The bed was narrow, but it wasn't the physical discomfort keeping her awake. She was thinking about Hayden. She imagined 2 versions of his return. In one, he was furious to force Cassandra to apologize, and then once the tension eased, asked Avery to let it go for the sake of the family. In the other, he understood that the lock wasn't the problem. It was the culmination of years of small surrenders. She didn't know which man was going to come back from Chicago. Around 2 in the morning, she opened her laptop and replied to the agent's message. She accepted the second apartment. She would sign the lease the next day. When she hit send, she felt afraid but not regret. She wasn't leaving Hayden in secret. She was building a place from which she could decide whether she wanted to stay with him, without the answer depending on whether she had a roof inside his family's home. The next morning was strangely quiet. Cassandra avoided any mention of the bedroom. Randall acted as though he didn't know his daughter-in-law had spent the night in the service wing. Diane barely touched her breakfast. Avery went to her studio, signed the lease, and asked for the keys in 48 hours. Then she bought packing boxes, and when she returned to the estate, began separating documents, clothing, and work materials. She didn't make noise or ask anyone for help. Margaret found her folding clothes in the service room and understood at once. She wanted to ask whether this meant the marriage was over, but Avery answered before she could ask. It means that when Hayden comes home, I'll be able to talk to him without being afraid that if I don't like his answer, I'll have nowhere to go. Margaret swallowed hard. There was more pain in that sentence than in any shouting match. Avery wasn't preparing a threat. She was recovering the freedom she needed so that whatever decision came next would truly be her own. That same afternoon, Diane entered the small room and closed the door behind her. She admitted she had made a mistake in believing she could control how far her silence would reach. She had wanted to see whether Hayden would respond when he found his wife without protection. But she had never imagined that Cassandra would go so far as to symbolically expel Avery from her own bedroom. Avery didn't let the admission pass without response. She told Diane that she had seen enough warning signs to know her daughter was interpreting the silence as endorsement. Perhaps she hadn't ordered the lock changed, but she had allowed the escalation to continue because she needed the test to become visible. Diane didn't deny it. She asked whether she should tell Hayden what had happened before he returned. Avery said no. Not anymore, because she wanted to help Diane with her experiment, but because she wanted to hear her husband's first instinctive response before anyone explained to him how he was supposed to feel. "This is my test now too," Avery said, "but not for him, for me." That night, Hayden called from Chicago. His face appeared on the screen with hotel lights behind him. He told her a negotiation had become complicated, and that he might need to extend the trip by 2 more days. Avery was sitting on the narrow bed, though she held the phone so he could only see a neutral wall behind her. Hayden asked if she was tired. She said yes. He said he hated being away and promised to make it up to her when he came back. Avery felt a tightening in her throat. She could have turned the camera around and shown him the room. She could have ended everything in seconds. Instead, she asked when he would know the new dates for certain. He said by the next morning. Before hanging up, he told her he loved her. Avery said it back. Then she placed the phone face down and looked at the 2 suitcases she had finished packing against the wall. The irony hurt. He was talking about coming home while she was preparing to leave it. What Avery didn't know was that barely an hour after that call, Hayden's negotiations shifted entirely. One of his partners accepted a term that allowed the deal to close ahead of schedule. The team celebrated and someone suggested dinner out. Hayden was about to agree, but then he thought about Avery. About her voice on the phone, strangely restrained. About the unease he had been feeling for days without being able to name it. He checked available flights and found a red-eye that would get him home 4 days ahead of schedule. He didn't tell anyone. He wanted to surprise his wife. While he was booking the ticket in Chicago, Avery was turning off the lamp in the service room, not knowing that this would be the last night she would have to wait for an answer. Within hours, Hayden would open the front door of the estate and discover that the real absence during his trip had not been his. It had been the place his wife had lost inside their own family. Hayden arrived at the estate a little before sunrise, the exhaustion of the flight still clinging to him and an unshakable unease he couldn't explain. He expected to find the house in silence. He expected to kiss Avery before she woke up and surprise her with the early return. But his key didn't fit the bedroom door. He tried twice, then a third time, each attempt a little less patient than the last. He thought he had grabbed the wrong key until he noticed the new hardware around the lock cylinder. He called Avery's name. No answer. He moved down the hall, opened 2 guest rooms, and had started toward the stairs when he noticed a faint light at the far end of the service corridor. There he found Margaret, who had woken up when she heard him come in. Her expression alarmed him more than any explanation could have. "Where is my wife?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer with words. She only looked toward the small room at the end of the hall. Hayden opened that door without imagining that the scene inside would hit him harder than any confrontation ever had. Avery was asleep on her side, in a bed too narrow for 2 people, a light blanket across her legs and her hair falling onto the pillow. Along the wall were 2 closed suitcases, several boxes of architecture materials, and a bag of documents. This was not the image of someone who had ended up there by accident. It was the image of someone preparing to leave. Hayden stood motionless for several seconds. Then he looked at Margaret and asked what had happened. She said that Avery should be the one to tell him. The tone was respectful, but firm. He felt something collapse inside him. He walked to the bed, said her name, and waited. Avery opened her eyes. It took a moment for her to recognize him, and instead of joy, her first reaction was something closer to exhausted sadness. "You came back early," she murmured as she sat up. Hayden wanted to ask about the suitcases, the room, the lock, everything at once. He pointed toward the door and asked why she was sleeping there. She told him that their bedroom had stopped being available to her. He thought he had misheard. He went back to the main hallway, examined the lock, and when Cassandra appeared from her room, drawn by the noise, he demanded to know who had ordered it changed. She began to explain that it was a temporary arrangement related to the event. The sentence didn't finish. Hayden asked Margaret to wake his parents, and within minutes, everyone was assembled in the kitchen. There he dropped the new key on the island and repeated the question no one seemed to want to answer. His anger came not only from what had happened, but from the fact that everyone had apparently spent several days simply accepting it. Cassandra defended herself first. She said Avery was blowing a household reorganization out of proportion and that no one had forced her to use the service room. There were perfectly good guest rooms available. Hayden looked at her in disbelief. "You changed the lock on the bedroom I share with my wife and then expected her to choose a guest room as though she were visiting?" Cassandra replied that the house belonged to the family and that managing access during the event preparation had been necessary. Hayden stepped toward the island, but Avery spoke before the confrontation could escalate. She said she didn't want this to become a scene, where he shouted and everyone apologized until the house recovered a false sense of normal. Randall urged everyone to stay calm. Hayden turned to his father and asked whether he had known that Avery was sleeping in the service wing. Randall lowered his eyes. That silence was its own answer. Hayden turned to his wife and told her to come upstairs with him. He said he would have the door opened immediately and that nobody would ever touch anything belonging to both of them again. Avery shook her head. "I don't need you to give me back a room," she said. "I need to understand why someone thought they could take it from me." The response dismantled the answer he already had prepared. He insisted that what had happened was unacceptable and that Cassandra would face consequences. Avery asked whether he truly believed all of this had started with a lock. He went quiet. She pointed to the suitcases and told him she had signed a lease for an apartment before knowing he would come home early. The news struck Hayden with unexpected force. He asked if she was walking away from him. Avery said she was leaving the estate. About the marriage, she had not yet decided anything. She needed to make that decision from a place where her housing didn't depend on her husband's family. Hayden felt a fear he had not even felt when he first found her in that room. Until that moment, he had imagined it would be enough to identify the person responsible, correct the injustice, and restore Avery to her rightful place. Now he understood she wasn't waiting to be rescued. She had already built herself a way out. He asked why she hadn't called him. Avery looked at him with a calm that was visibly exhausted and said that if she had called, he would have phoned Cassandra. He would have asked his mother to mediate. The problem would have been dissolved before he could see it, And then you would have come home convinced you had defended me, she added. Hayden wanted to argue, but he remembered too many times he had done precisely that. Stepped in just enough to stop the tension, never enough to change the pattern underneath it. Avery went on to say that she didn't need to find out whether he was capable of getting angry. She needed to know whether he could understand what he had been allowing for years. Cassandra cut in with a sharp remark, saying that Avery was using the situation to pull Hayden away from his family. This time, he didn't ask both sides to be reasonable. He turned to his sister and told her never again to speak about his wife as though she were an outsider. Cassandra's eyes widened at the tone. Hayden added that no one in that house had any authority to decide that Avery was less family than she was, simply for not carrying the Caldwell name. Randall tried to speak, but Hayden stopped him, asking where he had been while all of this was unfolding. His father said he hadn't wanted to make things worse by getting involved in a disagreement between two adult women. Hayden stared at him. That explanation felt disturbingly familiar. For years, he himself had used more polished versions of the same line. He didn't want to take sides. He didn't want to escalate. He didn't want to make a small problem bigger. For the first time, he heard how it sounded from the outside, like a comfortable way to leave the least protected person standing alone. Diane had still not spoken, and that silence was beginning to stand out. His mother was usually the first one to contain any household crisis. If Cassandra raised her voice, Diane corrected her. If Randall avoided a conversation, Diane circled back to it later. But that morning she was watching Avery with a mixture of guilt and understanding that Hayden couldn't interpret. He asked her directly when she had found out the lock had been changed. Diane said she had seen the locksmith but initially believed it was a repair. Hayden asked when she had understood the truth. His mother acknowledged it was when Avery returned from work and couldn't get in. And then what did you do? Diane took a breath before admitting that she had offered to reverse everything immediately. Avery stepped in to clarify that she had refused the offer. Hayden looked at her in confusion. Why? Her answer was simple. Because she no longer wanted anyone cleaning up the mess before he could see it himself. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Hayden stopped looking only at Cassandra and began observing his mother and his wife together, sensing a conversation between them that he had been excluded from. He asked what that meant. Avery said it wasn't the moment to explain everything because first she needed to go. She moved toward the service corridor to collect her things. Hayden followed, stepped into the small room with her, and saw up close how little she had brought there. A few items of clothing, her toiletry bag, her laptop, and some documents. Avery opened a suitcase. Hayden tried to help. She asked him not to. She didn't want her departure turned into a romantic gesture or an improvised reconciliation. He stood there helpless. Is there anything I can do right now? He asked. Avery closed the zipper and told him yes. Stop looking for the fast action that will erase your guilt, and start trying to understand why I needed the key to another apartment in the first place. Avery left the estate shortly after 7 in the morning. Margaret carried one of the boxes to the car, but Avery loaded the suitcases herself. Hayden stood near the entrance, wanting to stop her, and knowing that doing so would be repeating the same mistake he had always made, deciding for her what should happen, so that he could feel better. Before getting in the car, Avery told him not to follow her that day. She needed to walk into her new place alone and feel that she could open and close that door without asking anyone's permission. Hayden asked if he could call her later. She said yes, but not that morning. Then she was gone. Cassandra watched from an upstairs window. Diane stood behind Hayden several feet back. Randall had returned to the kitchen as though he didn't know what to do with his hands. When the car disappeared behind the gate, Hayden understood that the estate had never felt so large or so empty. In the hours that followed, Hayden walked through rooms he had known since childhood and began noticing things he had always treated as insignificant. He found the wedding photos inside a box. He saw the empty space where Avery's work folders had been. He discovered that several of her personal belongings had been moved to secondary closets. He asked Margaret when it had all started. She answered carefully, explaining that she couldn't share Avery's private conversations, but she could tell him what she had observed. Small decisions, comments, rearrangements, silences, all of them gradually narrowing the space Avery occupied in the house. Hayden asked if Avery had cried. Margaret shook her head. That seems to be what concerned everyone, she said quietly. Because she didn't cry, people assumed she could take it. The sentence made Hayden recall how many times he had described his wife as strong to justify not getting involved. He realized that sometimes he had called her strength the very loneliness he had helped create. By midday, Hayden confronted Cassandra in the living room. He wasn't shouting anymore. He asked her to explain exactly why she had ordered the lock changed. She kept insisting it was about controlling access during event preparations, that Avery had turned it into a symbol. Hayden replied that it was a symbol because she had decided who could enter a married couple's bedroom. Cassandra finally let the truth she had been dressing up in logistics slip out. She was tired of a woman who had married into the family, acting as though she could reshape the way the Caldwells did things. She said Hayden had changed since the wedding and was drifting further from his family every year. He understood then that the lock had never been about the event. It was a territorial statement. I am not drifting because Avery is pulling me away, he said. I am only seeing it now because I am discovering what you do when you believe my love for you will stop me from drawing a line. Cassandra looked at him as though he had committed a betrayal. Randall attempted to speak with his son afterward. He said he understood Hayden's anger, but that abandoning the family over a domestic dispute would be disproportionate. Hayden asked him whether he would have accepted someone changing the locks on the master bedroom that he and Diane shared. Randall said that never would have happened. Hayden asked how he was so certain. His father went quiet. Hayden then thought back to scenes from his childhood. Family members who picked at Diane during holiday dinners, comments she absorbed, disagreements that ended when Randall asked her not to make it a bigger thing than it was. He had never connected those memories to his own behavior. You loved her, Hayden said to his father, and you still left her alone rather than face your own people. Randall stiffened and said he would not allow his son to judge a decades-long marriage over situations he didn't fully understand. Hayden said he wasn't judging it. He was recognizing that he had learned from his father a particular form of cowardice that he had spent years calling prudence. By late afternoon, Hayden called Avery. She answered after several rings. Behind her voice was the echo of an almost empty apartment. He asked if she had gotten settled. She said she had a mattress, a folding table, and too many boxes, but that she was okay. He felt the impulse to offer furniture money, anything that would make her situation more comfortable. He stopped himself. Instead, he asked if she needed anything from him. She said no, not at the moment. Hayden told her he had spoken with Cassandra and with Randall. He didn't list what he had said, as though the words were achievements. He only admitted that he was beginning to understand how many times he had mistaken not raising his voice for not causing harm. Avery was quiet. Then she said that hearing that mattered, but that one right conversation after a disaster couldn't undo all the silences that had come before it. Hayden accepted that without defending himself. Before hanging up, he asked whether he could see her the next day. She said not yet. That night, Diane found Hayden alone on the back porch. He didn't let her start with general explanations. He asked her directly when she had stopped being surprised at the sight of Avery's packed suitcases, and why she seemed to already know that his wife had not called him during those days. Diane took too long to answer. Hayden thought back to the look that had passed between the two women at breakfast. The way Avery had referred to someone always cleaning up the damage before he could see it, and his mother's complete silence throughout the week. You already knew something was happening, he said. Diane acknowledged that she knew more than she had let on. Hayden asked since when. She rested her hands on the porch railing and looked away for a moment. When she finally spoke, she didn't try to protect herself. Before you left, I had already spoken with Avery, she admitted, about you. And yes, Hayden, I knew she wasn't going to call you. Diane did not try to buy time. She looked at Hayden there on the dark porch and acknowledged that before his trip she had spoken to Avery about his habit of stepping back from conflict within his own family. She told him she had deliberately chosen not to intervene during those days in order to see what happened when no one quietly corrected Cassandra's behavior before it escalated. Hayden listened with an expression that moved from confusion to disbelief. "You used my wife as a test to find out whether I was capable of defending her," he said. Diane replied that she had wanted to force him to see something he had been refusing to look at for years. Hayden struck the porch railing with his open palm, not to intimidate her, but because he needed somewhere to put a rage that didn't yet know which direction to go. "You could have just told me," he said quietly. Diane answered that she had told him, many times. He had always found a reasonable way to avoid actually hearing it. Hayden asked what exactly Avery had known going in. Diane walked him through the conversation in the sitting room. The question about independence. The warning that she would stop softening things. The request that Avery avoid calling in with each incident because an intervention from a distance would only let him hide once more behind quick solutions. Hayden stepped back. He suddenly understood that his wife had lived through those days, knowing that part of what was unfolding around her was being deliberately observed by his mother. And she had agreed to it. He asked if Avery had consented. Diane was firm. Avery had not agreed to be used. She had established her own conditions and made it clear that she would leave the moment she felt a real line had been crossed. "The mistake was mine," Diane said. "I thought I could step back far enough to observe without allowing anyone to actually hurt her. I underestimated Cassandra, and I overestimated my right to stage a lesson." Hayden turned toward the house. Through the windows he could see the dining room, where as a boy he had watched hundreds of arguments resolve the same way every time. His father lowering his voice, his mother swallowing something, everyone pretending afterward that nothing had truly happened. The next morning he asked Diane why she had come to believe any of this had been necessary. She took time answering, but when she did, she let go of the sharpness she usually used to protect herself. She told him that in her own early years of marriage, certain members of Randall's family had treated her like an outsider who should be grateful for every consideration she received. Randall had never insulted her. He had never permitted open cruelty, but every time someone crossed the line, he asked for patience, discretion, and time. Diane had learned to defend herself on her own. Decades later, when she heard Hayden tell Avery not to turn every comment from Cassandra into a battle, she recognized the same words, even though they came from her son's mouth. "I wanted to stop you from becoming your father," she said. Hayden told her that in trying to prevent it, she had ended up doing to Avery what the people who had hurt her so deeply had done long ago. She had decided that someone else should endure something for a reason that felt justified to the person deciding it. That landed. Diane closed her eyes for a moment and admitted he was right. She had confused exposing a problem with manufacturing a situation to demonstrate it. Hayden asked whether she had ordered the lock changed. Diane answered with absolute clarity that she had not. She had not known that Cassandra was moving Avery's belongings, making unilateral decisions, and reading her silence as permission for each new step. She had never imagined her daughter would lock the door to a married couple's bedroom. When she finally understood what had happened, she offered to reverse it immediately. Avery refused because she no longer trusted that fixing things before Hayden returned would accomplish anything real. Hayden understood then that the lock had been Cassandra's doing, but the space in which that cruelty had been allowed to grow had been built by many people, including him. The morning after Hayden called Avery and told her he now knew about the conversation she had had with Diane before his trip. He didn't ask for an explanation. He also didn't use the discovery to accuse her of having subjected him to a test. Avery was quiet for a moment before saying she would rather talk in person. They met at a coffee shop near her studio. When Hayden arrived, he found her at a window seat with an open notebook and a nearly untouched coffee. He sat across from her and told her his mother had explained everything. Avery asked him what he understood by everything. Hayden said that Diane had deliberately withdrawn her protection during his trip in order to see whether he was capable of recognizing a pattern he had been repeating for years. Avery closed the notebook. Then she told him she had also made clear to Diane that she was never willing to be the reward if he passed her test. Hayden nodded. For once, he did not try to soften an uncomfortable truth. Avery explained that Diane's proposal had felt offensive at first. Then she recognized that there was a question she had been avoiding for too long herself. She didn't need to find out whether Hayden could get angry when he found her sleeping in a service room. That much was already obvious. What she needed to know was whether after the initial fury, he would go back to asking her to forgive the family quickly for everyone's sake. She needed to see whether he could hold a line when the tension lasted not minutes, but days. Because that has always been the problem, she said. You defended me until defending me meant making someone you loved uncomfortable. Then you would ask me to be understanding. Hayden didn't argue. Avery added that Diane was wrong if she believed her son could be evaluated through another person's suffering. And she herself would have been wrong to stay there simply to find the answer. That was why she had signed the lease on the apartment. Hayden told her about his conversation with his mother and acknowledged something that cost him to say out loud. Diane was not the only one who had used Avery's resilience as an excuse. He had done it too. He could recall every time he had told himself his wife was smart enough, confident enough, and capable enough to handle a difficult dinner or an unkind comment without him needing to say a word. Avery listened without interrupting. Hayden said he had gone through the house and found wedding photos in a box, empty spaces where her work materials used to be, personal items that had been moved to back closets. None of those things had happened in a vacuum. They had been possible because everyone understood that he preferred to deal with the aftermath rather than question the system that made them possible in the first place. I don't want you to forgive me because I finally raised my voice louder than Cassandra, he said. I don't even want you to come back because I did something right yesterday. I want to stop being the man who needs to find his wife locked out of a bedroom before he understands that he has been leaving her alone for years. Avery looked down, visibly affected, but she did not offer a reconciliation. That afternoon, Avery chose to face Diane directly. She wanted no private conversation full of guilt and half-finished sentences. They met in the home office of the estate, with Hayden present, because the conflict involved him too. Avery asked her mother-in-law whether she truly believed she had the right to use her as an instrument for correcting her son. Diane said no, not after seeing the result. Avery pressed further. The problem was not only that Cassandra had gone too far. Even if no one had ever changed the lock, Diane had chosen to stand by and watch a woman be demeaned in order to provoke a future reaction in a man. You suffered because others decided you should endure it to preserve a marriage, Avery said. And then you decided I should endure it to improve mine. Diane received that without trying to defend her intention. She admitted she had repeated the same logic she had always condemned, under a different justification. Hayden spoke only to say that the conversation could not end with the conclusion that he had passed some kind of exam. Avery looked at him, surprised. He explained that coming back early and getting angry didn't prove anything. The real test started now, in the days ahead, when there was no dramatic scene for him to react to. Diane nodded slowly. Avery replied that it was precisely for that reason that she would continue living in her apartment. She didn't want to move back into the estate while everyone was ashamed and temporarily willing to behave. She needed to see what happened after the scandal stopped feeling recent. Hayden accepted that without protest. Then he said something neither Avery nor Diane expected. He wouldn't be staying at the estate either. Diane frowned and asked if he was planning to leave as a form of punishment. Hayden said no. He said that for too long he had believed that being an adult meant working hard, earning well, and making business decisions, while continuing to live inside a family structure where he had never learned to set real boundaries. He needed to do that now. When Randall found out that Hayden planned to move out, he reacted harder than Cassandra had. He found him packing in the bedroom, the lock of which had already been restored, and asked whether he was truly willing to fracture the family over a conflict that could be resolved. Hayden set a shirt on the bed and asked what family unity actually meant. Randall spoke of shared years' responsibilities and respect for the home where Hayden had grown up. Hayden replied that none of those things required living under the same roof, nor allowing his wife to be treated as a house guest. Randall insisted that Diane had admitted her mistake and that Cassandra would calm down eventually. Hayden smiled with quiet sadness. That is exactly the model I learned from you. waiting for everyone to settle down so that nothing ever actually has to change. Randall denied that both situations were comparable. Hayden asked him when the last time was that he had defended Diane before she had to defend herself. His father had no answer. The argument between father and son eventually led Randall to Diane. For the first time in years, he asked her directly whether she had spent their marriage feeling abandoned whenever his family was the source of the problem. Diane did not use the crisis as an opportunity to revisit old wounds, but she didn't lie either. She said yes, she had loved Randall and still did, but there had been stretches of time when his silence hurt her more than anything his relatives had ever said directly. Randall tried to remind her that he had always supported her in private. Diane replied that that had been exactly the problem. In private, you told me I was right. In public, you asked me for patience. Hayden, who had come to the office doorway, listened without interrupting. Randall seemed to age several years during that exchange. Avery's story was forcing everyone to look at something the Caldwell family had been dressing up for decades, calling it temperament, tradition, or discretion. The silence had never been neutral. It had simply always protected whoever needed protection least. Cassandra refused to accept that reading. She accused Diane of having let her act freely and then turning her into the only one to blame. Diane acknowledged that her silence had been irresponsible, but reminded her daughter that she had never told her to humiliate Avery or change the lock. Cassandra said she had interpreted the absence of any pushback as a sign that her mother finally saw things the same way she did. That explains what you thought, Diane answered. It doesn't excuse what you did. Cassandra then looked toward Hayden, perhaps hoping that a sibling bond would soften the situation. He told her he had no intention of cutting her out of his life, but he also would not pretend that a forced apology made everything right. Their relationship would be different going forward. From that moment on, Cassandra had no authority over his private decisions, his home, or his marriage. She replied that Avery had accomplished exactly what she wanted, which was to separate him from his family. Hayden shook his head slowly. No. What she did was stop accepting that you got to decide how much space she was allowed to take up. 2 days later, Hayden found a furnished apartment in a neighborhood closer to downtown, near enough to work and far enough from the estate to force him to build a new daily routine. He didn't tell Avery right away. He wanted to be certain the decision didn't look like a move designed to impress her. He told his parents first. Diane accepted it with a quiet sadness. Randall asked how long he planned to keep this up. Hayden said it wasn't a demonstration, and that was exactly why he intended to keep it. Margaret helped him with a few boxes, though he handled most of it himself. While taking books and clothing from the bedroom, he came across something Avery had left behind. A small metal measuring tape she always kept in her bag for site visits. He held it for a moment and remembered how many times she had measured out spaces for other people, while he had assumed she would always have a space reserved for her inside her own home. He put the measuring tape in his jacket pocket. That evening, he asked to see Avery. She agreed to let him come by the apartment, but made clear she didn't want a romantic dinner or a prepared speech. Hayden arrived with a small bag and nothing else. When he walked in, he noticed the near-empty space. A simple table, 2 mismatched chairs, several boxes still closed, blueprints leaning against a wall. Avery offered him water. He took out the measuring tape and set it on the table. She gave a small smile and she recognized it. Then he told her he had moved out of the estate. She looked up immediately. He explained that he had signed a lease on his own apartment and was not asking her to move in with him. He also wasn't walking away from his family or trying to punish anyone. He had simply understood that staying in that house while demanding things change was asking everyone to behave differently within the same structure that had made those behaviors possible in the first place. Avery was quiet for a moment, thinking, not about the decision itself, but about the reason he gave for it. Hayden added that he didn't want his moving out to become a bargaining chip. He wasn't expecting to hear that it proved his love or that it made up for years of passivity. Avery asked what would happen if she ultimately decided not to come back to him. The question stung, but he answered without hesitating. He would stay out of the estate regardless. Then maybe for the first time, this is actually your decision and not a reaction to mine, Avery said. He accepted that. He also told her he had spoken with Cassandra, that he would not allow further interference, and that he was not going to pressure her into any family reconciliation either. Avery listened but kept a careful distance. She told him that changing direction was straightforward. Sustaining a new way of living for months would be another matter. Hayden said he knew. Then he looked around the apartment and asked if he could help assemble a bookshelf he noticed still in pieces against the wall. Avery hesitated, then pointed to the parts. They worked for nearly an hour without talking about the marriage. Hayden held pieces in place while Avery read the instructions and corrected the bracket position twice. There were moments that felt strangely ordinary, seconds in which both of them forgot the weight of everything that had brought them here. When they finished, the shelf was slightly uneven. Avery looked at it and said that a chief executive could close international deals, but apparently not build a straight piece of furniture. Hayden let out a brief laugh, the first one since he had come home. Then both of them were quiet. It was not a reconciliation, but it didn't feel like a goodbye either. Before leaving, Hayden set the estate keys on the table. Avery's eyes moved to them. He explained that he no longer needed them. I don't want you going back to a house where you have to ask who is allowed to open your own door, he said. If we ever live together again, I want it to be somewhere we build from the start. Avery looked at the keys but didn't pick them up. As Hayden reached the door, she called his name. He turned around, expecting perhaps a final answer. She told him that what he had done mattered, but that she still didn't know whether it was enough. He nodded. He did not ask for a timeline, a promise, or a formal second chance. He only said that this time he was not going to rush her just so that he could feel better. He left, pulling the door quietly closed behind him. Avery stood near the table, looking at the estate keys and the measuring tape she had left behind. For years she had thought that the conflict was about whether Hayden loved her enough. Now she understood that the real question had always been something harder. Whether both of them could build a relationship where loving each other didn't mean one of them had to remain permanently exposed in order to keep the other comfortable. Out on the street, Hayden walked toward his new apartment without knowing whether he would ever share a home with her again. And for the first time, he accepted that real change meant making it, even without any guarantee of getting her back. The family gathering took place 1 week later, not because Avery had agreed to return to the estate, but because Diane had requested a conversation on terms Avery herself had set. No dinner, no staff moving in and out, no performing normalcy before the real conversation happened. Avery arrived that afternoon to find Hayden, Randall, Diane, and Cassandra seated in the main living room. Margaret was not present. Diane had wanted the weight of that moment to rest only on the people who had actually played a part in what happened. Avery set her bag at her feet and sat across from them. She had brought no suitcase and no key to the estate. Diane spoke first. She said she was not expecting automatic forgiveness or a ceremonial reconciliation. She had asked for this meeting to say, out loud, in front of everyone, what the Caldwell family had long preferred to handle behind closed doors. Who had caused harm, who had stayed silent, and who needed to accept the consequences. She started with herself. She admitted that she had deliberately withdrawn her protection during Hayden's trip because she wanted to see whether her son was capable of recognizing a pattern he had been living inside for years. She believed she could manage the situation as though Avery's dignity were a variable she could measure without causing a real wound. I did not order the lock changed, she said, but I allowed the environment to reach the point where Cassandra believed she could. Avery did not look away. Diane continued, acknowledging that when she finally understood the extent of what had happened, she had tried to stop it, but by then it was too late. She told them all plainly that her intentions did not make her decision right, and that having suffered something similar long ago did not give her any right to subject Avery to a different version of the same pain. Randall watched his wife as though hearing for the first time a story that had always been in front of him. Cassandra waited until Diane finished and then defended herself. She said she felt used. Her mother had chosen not to act and was now pointing at her as though everything had originated solely with her. Diane accepted a portion of that, Her silence had been irresponsible. But then she asked a question that left Cassandra without an immediate answer. Did I ever ask you to take down Avery's photographs? To move her work materials? To say in front of strangers that she wasn't family? To change the lock, Cassandra looked toward Hayden. He remained still. Diane continued. Interpreting someone's failure to set limits as permission does not eliminate the responsibility of the person who chose to cross them. Avery spoke then. She said she didn't want Cassandra turned into a convenient villain so the rest of them could appear less guilty. What had happened had only been possible because each person had contributed something. Contempt, silence, cowardice, a misguided idea of what loyalty was supposed to look like. Randall received those words with visible discomfort. He said he had never wanted Avery to feel pushed out, and that if he had understood the seriousness of what was happening, he would have acted. Avery replied calmly that that was precisely the problem. He had needed the injustice to reach a sufficiently dramatic level before he could recognize it. The smaller abuses had not seemed worth confronting because they didn't threaten his own comfort. Hayden looked down. Randall asked whether everyone was going to hold him responsible for not turning every household tension into a crisis. Diane answered before Avery could. I don't blame you for not raising your voice. I blame you for asking me so many times to endure things so that you would never have to choose. Randall sat quietly. Hayden raised his eyes toward his father and understood that this conversation was not only resolving a crisis, it was dismantling a family tradition built around calling the absence of limits by the name of maturity. When it was his turn, Hayden did not present a list of changes as though they were credentials. He said only that he no longer lived at the estate and had no plans to return on a permanent basis. He had been learning to manage his own apartment, cooking poorly, forgetting basic groceries, and discovering how many things he had taken for granted for decades. Cassandra let out a dry laugh and asked whether he expected everyone to applaud his belated independence. Hayden said no. That was precisely why he hadn't told everyone the details of his new routine. He hadn't wanted to turn a necessary decision into a performance for Avery's benefit. He also said that going forward, any relationship with his sister would depend on her respecting the boundaries of his marriage, even if he and Avery ultimately did not stay together. This is not about whether she comes back to me, he said. It is about who I decide to be when no one is watching. Avery heard that last sentence with an emotion she worked to keep contained. It was the response she had needed from the beginning. It had arrived at a high price. She looked at Hayden and told him she appreciated that he was changing, without demanding anything in return. But she didn't want the story to end with the idea that he had done enough right things, and therefore she owed him a return. A second chance was not a debt. Hayden nodded. Then Avery turned to Diane and added that she didn't want the family to transform this meeting into a trial to determine who deserved forgiveness. She had not come to distribute absolutions. She had come to make one thing permanently clear. She would never again live in a place where her sense of belonging could be revised based on someone's mood, their last name, or her husband's travel schedule. Diane accepted that without negotiating. For the first time, no one asked Avery to do anything so the rest of them could feel better about themselves. Avery looked over at Cassandra, half expecting anger. Instead, she found something different. Fear. For the first time, Cassandra seemed to understand that her real punishment was not losing influence in the house. It was discovering that the family she had tried to protect through control would accept that control as a substitute for love. Cassandra did not offer a perfect apology. She didn't give a speech or cry. She simply looked at Avery and said that she had wanted her to feel temporary. She thought that if Avery understood the house had existed long before her, she would stop questioning the way the Caldwells did things. I didn't think you would actually leave, she admitted. Avery answered that that had been the error everyone shared. They had all assumed she would absorb whatever came at her because walking away from a comfortable life seemed too hard to actually do. I was never strong because I could take it, she said. I was strong when I decided I didn't have to anymore. After the meeting, Avery went upstairs one last time to the bedroom she had shared with Hayden. The original lock had been restored and the room looked exactly as it always had, but she felt that it belonged to another chapter of her life now. On the dresser she found the wedding photograph that Margaret had quietly put back. She picked it up and held it. In the photo, Hayden was looking at her with a happiness that had never been false. That was perhaps the most painful part of everything. The love had been real even while they were building a broken dynamic together. Hayden appeared in the doorway. He didn't step inside until Avery gave him a small signal. He asked if she wanted to take anything. She looked around the room and shook her head. Then she spotted the old estate key sitting on a tray. She picked it up and walked with Hayden to the living room and set it on the table. "I don't want this key," she said. "I don't want to reclaim a door that already showed me everything I needed to know." The weeks that followed did not bring a quick reconciliation. Avery stayed in her apartment and went on with her work. Hayden respected the distance. They met for coffee and afternoon walks and occasional simple dinners in places where no one knew the Caldwell name. Sometimes they talked about what had happened. Other times they argued about films, architecture projects, or minor frustrations from their separate apartments. One evening Hayden confessed that he had ruined a shirt by washing darks and lights together. Avery laughed, but afterward she noticed something more important than the joke. Hayden had stopped presenting every difficulty as something another person should fix for him. When Diane called asking him to come to the estate for minor matters, he learned to say no without inventing excuses. When Cassandra protested the distance, he didn't blame Avery. He explained his decision and held the line even when his sister got angry. Randall also began to change slowly, not overnight and not dramatically, but Diane noticed small differences. When a relative made a dismissive comment during a family lunch, Randall corrected her before Diane had to respond. There were no raised voices. He simply said he would not allow his wife to be spoken about that way in his presence. Later, Diane told him quietly that she had been waiting decades to hear something that simple. Randall didn't ask for recognition. He acknowledged that for years he had believed defending her in private was enough because he feared that confronting his family openly would cost him the peace of the whole gathering. He now understood that the peace had always been paid for by her. Diane did not absolve herself either. She told him she was learning to stop managing her children's relationships under the guise of protecting them. Both of them understood that repairing a marriage of decades would be different from starting a new one, but for the first time they seemed willing to look at their mistakes without turning them into permanent explanations for why nothing could change. With Cassandra, progress was slower. She avoided Avery entirely for several days. Then she sent a short message asking if they could meet. Avery agreed to a coffee, but made clear she wasn't ready for manufactured warmth. Cassandra arrived without her usual confidence. She said she wasn't expecting to be forgiven, and that she still believed Diane had created a situation she couldn't control, but she was no longer using that as a reason to excuse herself. She admitted that changing the lock had been deliberate. She had wanted Avery to feel like she could be displaced at any moment. "I thought if you understood that you were replaceable, you would stop pushing back against me," she said. Avery replied that that sentence was more valuable than a polished apology because at least it named the truth. She made no promise of friendship. She only said that any future relationship would be built on consistent behavior over time. Cassandra left that coffee shop without knowing when or whether she would receive anything back. 3 months later, Hayden asked Avery to come see an empty apartment in a new building. He hadn't signed anything. He told her he had come across the listing and thought she might like it because of the natural light, a small terrace, and enough open space for her to set up a drafting table. Avery looked at him carefully. He immediately explained that he wasn't expecting her to move in with him. He just wanted to show it to her because he had learned something important. Whatever home they might one day share if that day came, had to be a decision they made together from the very first moment. Avery walked through the rooms, paused in the bedroom, and studied the door. Hayden, following her gaze, asked if the lock met her standards. She laughed unexpectedly. Then she told him she didn't need a perfect lock. She needed to know that if anyone ever tried to lock her out, she would not have to begin by explaining why that was serious. Hayden said he knew. He didn't add anything more. Avery walked to the terrace and looked out at the city in the afternoon light. For months she had been waiting to feel a complete certainty before deciding anything about her marriage. But standing there, she understood that no healthy relationship comes with full guarantees. What she could evaluate were the actions in front of her. Hayden had maintained his limits with his family when she wasn't there to witness it. He had continued living on his own without turning that into a demonstration. He had accepted the possibility of losing her without using guilt money or pressure to bring her back. And above all, he had stopped asking her to come home as proof that she had forgiven him. Avery turned to face him and said that she still wasn't ready to move in right away. Hayden nodded. Then she said that she did want to look for a place together. Not necessarily that one that both of them chose. He took a moment to understand the difference between the two sentences. Then he smiled without closing the distance between them until she reached out her hand. They did not celebrate at the estate. There was no big dinner and no formal announcement. In the weeks that followed, they visited apartments and argued about layout, budget, commute times, and how much sunlight the kitchen needed. Avery enjoyed something she had not thought to value before, the ability to disagree without every difference becoming a question of who truly belonged. They finally chose a moderately sized apartment with a small study for her work and a balcony where Hayden could watch the sunrise before heading to the office. Both of them signed the lease. When the keys arrived, Hayden placed them on his open palm and asked Avery to take one first. She looked at him with a quiet amusement and said they didn't need to turn every key into a symbol. Still, she picked one up and slipped it into her bag. Hayden took the other. Neither of them had more right than the other to open that door. Months later, Avery returned to the estate for a family lunch. As she walked through the main hallway, she passed the door of the old bedroom and kept moving without stopping. She felt no anger and no nostalgia. That door had stopped being the center of the story because in the end, everyone had come to understand that it had never been about wood or locks or rooms. It had always been about who had the right to define where another person belonged and how many times love could stay silent before silence became participation in the harm. Hayden walked beside her. He didn't take her hand to guide her. He waited until Avery reached for his. In the dining room, Diane had set a place for Avery without ceremony, exactly the same as for everyone else. No one felt the need to announce that she was welcome there. And that quiet absence of explanation was perhaps the first genuine sign that something had actually changed. That evening, back in their own home, Avery set her keys on the table beside Hayden's. He asked her if she ever regretted leaving that morning. She thought about the narrow bed, the packed suitcases, the fear she had felt when she signed a lease without knowing what would become of her marriage. Then she shook her head. Leaving didn't destroy what we had, she said. It stopped us from calling it love, when really it was just me enduring things, so everyone else could stay comfortable. Hayden acknowledged that coming home early had changed his life, but Avery corrected him gently. What mattered wasn't that you came home early, she said. It was that when you found the door locked, you finally asked who had locked it, instead of asking me to learn how to live on the outside. Both of them understood then that the measure of real love is not how much pain a person can absorb. It is how fiercely we protect each other's dignity before it becomes too late to matter.